The snow fell in delicate sheets over the dense forest, blanketing the world in a serene quiet that seemed to amplify the crackling of the fire within the small mountain cabin. The man sat in his favorite chair, the worn leather creaking softly beneath him. His sharp eyes scanned the fading embers of his hearth as he sipped a steaming cup of tea. Though solitude was a comfort he had come to cherish in these rugged woods, his thoughts drifted to the extraordinary encounter that had unfolded here just a year ago. He had met her then, an alien huntress unlike anything he had ever imagined. Sleek, otherworldly, and fierce, she had moved with a fluid grace that made the forest seem clumsy in comparison. Her eyes, glowing faintly with an unearthly light, had told him of distant stars and silent, cosmic hunts. She had entered his world like a tempest, and though their meeting had been brief, it left a mark on his soul. Now, on a crisp winter's night, he allowed himself to wonder if she might return. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as foolish. Their worlds were too different, their meeting a mere ripple in the vast ocean of existence. Still, he couldn't help but glance toward the door every now and then, his senses keen despite his own protests. The wind outside howled, and for a moment, it seemed the storm itself rapped against his door. But as the sound grew persistent, the man set his mug aside, his breath catching in his throat. Rising from his chair, he approached the door cautiously, his boots crunching against the wooden floor. He opened it to find a sight that stole the air from his lungs. There she stood, her figure framed by the swirling snow and the darkness of the forest beyond. But this time, she wore an unexpected guise, a red velvet Santa suit trimmed with white fur. The ensemble clung to her athletic frame, the absurdity of the costume contrasted by the regal poise with which she carried herself. Over one shoulder, a satchel of strange design hung loosely, and her alien eyes shone with quiet amusement. "You," he managed, his voice rough from shock. She stepped forward, her movements as precise as he remembered, her boots crunching on the snow-covered porch. A smirk played on her lips, though smirk was a generous interpretation of the subtle upward curve of her alien features. She inclined her head slightly, as if to say, "Yes, it's me." Without a word, she brushed past him into the cabin, her presence filling the small space with an air of otherworldly authority. She set the satchel on the floor near the fire and turned to face him, her expression expectant. The man closed the door behind her, sealing out the icy wind. He blinked at her, trying to reconcile the fierce huntress he had met with the bizarrely festive figure before him. Finally, he found his voice. "Happy holidays," he ventured, his tone tinged with uncertainty. Her head tilted, a gesture of understanding. Then, to his surprise, she reached into her satchel and began pulling out items. Small, gleaming artifacts of alien origin, each one wrapped in what appeared to be shimmering metallic paper. She placed them on the small table by the fire, her movements deliberate. The man watched in stunned silence until she gestured for him to sit. He complied, sinking back into his chair as she settled herself across from him. The firelight danced across her features, casting shadows that made her seem even more enigmatic. She opened her hands, palms up, and began to speak, not with words, but through a series of gestures and subtle sounds, accompanied by a faint glow in her eyes. Though he didn't understand her language, the intent was clear. She had come bearing gifts, and she wished to share a moment of connection, perhaps even gratitude. The man found himself smiling despite the surreal nature of the scene. "Well," he said, leaning forward, "I guess it's my turn." He rose, retrieving a bottle of aged whiskey from his cupboard and pouring 2 glasses. He handed one to her, wondering if she could, or would, drink it. She studied the amber liquid, then mimicked his movements, taking a tentative sip. Her reaction was subtle, but he thought he saw a flicker of approval in her glowing eyes. They sat there, sharing the warmth of the fire and the silence of the night. The man felt the weight of his isolation lift, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't companionship, exactly, but it was close enough. And as the snow continued to fall outside, he realized that some connections transcended language, culture, and even worlds. Though they exchanged no formal words of farewell when she eventually rose to leave, her parting glance lingered. It was a promise, he thought, a quiet assurance that their paths would cross again. When she disappeared into the storm, the man returned to his chair, the alien artifacts still gleaming on his table. He didn't know what they meant or why she had chosen to return, but as he sipped his whiskey, he realized it didn't matter. Some mysteries were best left unsolved, to be savored like the fleeting magic of a snowy winter's night. The days following her departure were filled with a strange, lingering energy. The man couldn't stop glancing at the alien artifacts she had left behind. They pulsed faintly with an inner light, their surfaces smooth and warm to the touch despite their alien design. Each seemed crafted with a purpose beyond his comprehension. One spiraled like a nautilus shell, another was a flat disc covered in delicate etchings, and one resembled a sphere of liquid metal, shifting shape ever so slightly when held. He placed them on his mantel above the fire, an unconventional centerpiece that contrasted with the rugged simplicity of his cabin. Though he didn't know what they were or why she had brought them, they seemed to radiate an aura of benevolence, as if her visit had left more than just memories. Life returned to its usual rhythm in the mountains, though the man found himself scanning the forest horizon more often. He hunted and chopped wood, his days consumed by the quiet routines of survival, yet he couldn't shake the thought that she might come back again. The Santa suit, of all things, replayed in his mind as an amusing detail. Did she understand the cultural significance, or had it simply been a strange choice? One particularly cold evening, he decided to inspect the artifacts more closely. By now, curiosity had outweighed his trepidation. He started with the spiraled one, tracing the grooves with his fingers. As he did, the object hummed softly, responding to his touch. A soft, ethereal melody filled the room, the notes delicate and haunting, like whispers of distant stars. It wasn't music in the human sense, it was something else, something that seemed to speak directly to his emotions. The sound tugged at him, stirring memories he hadn't revisited in years. His childhood, the first time he saw snow, the bittersweet moments of love and loss. He sat transfixed, tears slipping down his cheeks unbidden. When the melody ended, the cabin seemed even quieter than before, as if the artifact had carried him briefly beyond the constraints of time. The second artifact, the flat disc, was more enigmatic. Its surface shimmered like the northern lights, and when he tilted it, he could make out faint, moving images, scenes of a vast alien world. Towering spires rose above lush jungles, creatures with gliding wings darted between them, and a crimson sun hung low on the horizon. The man realized he was seeing her home, or at least a part of it. His heart tightened with awe and an inexplicable pang of longing. The sphere, however, proved the most perplexing. When he held it, the liquid metal shifted to form shapes that mimicked his gestures, a wolf howling, a bird in flight, a hand reaching toward the sky. It seemed to respond to his thoughts, transforming into images pulled from the deepest corners of his mind. When he set it down, it reformed into its original smooth shape, as if waiting for his next touch. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars twinkled outside, the man felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The gifts were not just tokens, they were a bridge, a way for her to share fragments of her world with him. He could only hope she understood how much they meant. Weeks turned into months, and winter's grip on the mountains began to loosen. The snow melted, revealing patches of green beneath, and the days grew longer. The man resumed his outdoor work in earnest, chopping wood and tending to repairs around the cabin. Yet, every time he ventured into the forest, he found himself scanning for signs of her. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, he heard a familiar sound, a faint hum, like the resonance of the artifacts but deeper and more primal. He froze, his heart quickening. Turning slowly, he saw her emerge from the trees, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. This time, she wore no festive costume. She was dressed in the same sleek alien garb as their first meeting, her bearing as regal as ever. Over her shoulder, she carried a new satchel, and in her hand, she held a staff that seemed to hum with energy. The man stepped forward, his breath catching. "You came back." Her glowing eyes met his, and she inclined her head in acknowledgement. This time, her presence felt less like a surprise and more like a continuation of something unspoken. Without hesitation, she gestured toward the cabin, and the man nodded, leading the way. Inside, the Huntress placed the satchel on the table and began unpacking its contents. The man watched as she revealed a collection of items, more artifacts, but also what appeared to be tools, maps, and small containers filled with shimmering powders. She laid them out methodically, then turned to him, her expression serious. Though they still lacked a common language, her gestures and the intensity in her gaze conveyed her purpose. She needed his help. She pointed to one of the maps, which displayed a topographical layout of the surrounding mountains. One area was marked with an iridescent symbol, and when the man touched it, the map glowed faintly. He understood. Something important awaited them there. "You want me to go with you," he said, half a question, half a statement. She nodded, her alien features softening with what he interpreted as gratitude. Then she picked up the sphere from his mantle, holding it briefly before placing it back, as if reminding him of the connection they shared. The man felt a mixture of apprehension and exhilaration. Though he had no idea what awaited them, he knew he couldn't refuse. Something about her, about this bond they had forged, compelled him to follow her into the unknown. Grabbing his coat and gear, he met her gaze. "Let's go." The Huntress smiled faintly, her version of a smile, and together they stepped out into the encroaching night, their journey just beginning. The forest was alive with the sounds of twilight, a symphony of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. The man followed the Huntress closely, his boots crunching over the underbrush while her footsteps seemed to whisper over the ground. She moved with an effortless grace, her staff glowing faintly to illuminate their path. The man had never ventured this deep into the wilderness before, but he trusted her implicitly. As the hours passed, the terrain grew more rugged. Rocky inclines and narrow paths tested the man's endurance, but the Huntress pressed on with unwavering determination. Every so often, she would pause to consult the glowing map, her luminous eyes scanning the symbols before she adjusted their course. Though their communication was wordless, her gestures were clear, and he felt a strange sense of harmony as they worked together. They stopped briefly at a small stream to refill their canteens. The man crouched by the water, his breath misting in the chilly air, while the Huntress stood nearby, her gaze sweeping the forest as if searching for unseen dangers. He couldn't help but marvel at her presence. She was an enigma, a living paradox, both alien and strangely familiar. Her confidence and composure made him feel as though he had known her for much longer than he had. As they resumed their journey, the terrain began to change. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged cliffs and rocky plateaus. The air grew colder, sharper, and the faint hum of the artifacts she carried seemed to resonate more strongly. It was as if the land itself was responding to her presence. Finally, they arrived at a hidden valley, shrouded in mist and ringed by towering peaks. The man had never seen anything like it, a place that felt untouched by time, sacred and otherworldly. At the center of the valley stood a massive structure, its shape resembling an ancient obelisk but with an unmistakable alien design. It pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, casting long shadows over the frost-covered ground. The Huntress motioned for him to stay close as they approached. Her steps were deliberate now, her staff humming louder with each step. The man felt his pulse quicken as they neared the obelisk, its surface shimmering like liquid starlight. Strange symbols covered its surface, shifting and rearranging as if alive. "What is this place?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. She didn't answer, of course, but her focus never wavered. She placed her hand against the obelisk, and a ripple of light spread outward from her touch. The symbols glowed brighter, and a low, resonant tone filled the air, vibrating in the man's chest. He instinctively took a step back, his instincts torn between awe and apprehension. The obelisk began to shift, its surface parting like petals of a giant flower. Inside was a chamber, glowing with an otherworldly light. The Huntress gestured for him to follow, and despite his hesitation, he obeyed. Together, they stepped into the chamber, where the air seemed to hum with raw energy. The interior was unlike anything the man had ever seen. The walls were alive with moving patterns, and the floor pulsed gently beneath their feet. At the center of the chamber was a pedestal, upon which rested a small, crystalline object. It glowed with a brilliance that made it difficult to look at directly. The Huntress approached the pedestal, her movements reverent. She reached out, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the crystal. The moment she did, the chamber brightened, and a surge of energy coursed through the air. The man shielded his eyes as the light grew almost blinding. When the glow subsided, the Huntress turned to him, the crystal cradled in her hands. Her expression was one of triumph, but also urgency. She held the crystal out to him, as if inviting him to share in its significance. He hesitated, then reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a flood of images and sensations overwhelmed him. He saw her world in vivid detail, the sprawling cities, the endless skies, the creatures that roamed its landscapes. He felt her emotions, her determination, her longing. It was as if their minds had briefly intertwined, and in that instant, he understood. The crystal wasn't just an artifact, it was a key. A key to something vast and ancient, something that connected her world to his. And though he couldn't fully grasp its purpose, he knew it was crucial. When the connection broke, the man stumbled back, gasping for air. The huntress steadied him, her touch firm but gentle. She nodded, her eyes conveying gratitude and a quiet reassurance. Then she gestured toward the entrance of the chamber, indicating it was time to leave. As they stepped out into the valley, the obelisk sealed itself once more, its glow fading to a faint pulse. The huntress secured the crystal in her satchel, then turned to face the man. Though no words passed between them, he felt the weight of her thanks. She had achieved what she came for, and she couldn't have done it without him. But their journey wasn't over. As they made their way back through the rugged terrain, the man couldn't shake the feeling that the crystal's purpose was only the beginning. The huntress had chosen to share this moment with him, to trust him with a fragment of her world, and he knew it would change his life forever. For now, though, he was content to follow her through the wilderness, their bond deepened by the shared mystery of the obelisk and the crystal. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains, painting the world in gold, he felt a quiet certainty that their story was far from finished. The return journey to the cabin carried an unspoken weight. The man noticed the huntress was quieter, her movements more deliberate. The crystalline artifact in her satchel seemed to hum faintly, as though it was alive and attuned to her presence. He didn't ask questions, not because he didn't want answers, but because he sensed she wasn't ready to give them. She moved with the focus of someone carrying both purpose and burden. When they finally reached the cabin, the forest was bathed in twilight. The man opened the door, letting the warmth of the fire embrace them both. She stepped inside and set the satchel carefully on the table. For the first time since they had entered the obelisk, she exhaled deeply, as though the weight of the crystal, and what it meant, had only now begun to settle on her shoulders. The man poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one across the table toward her. It had become their unspoken ritual, a small gesture of camaraderie. She picked up the glass, studying the amber liquid before taking a sip. Her expression softened, and he couldn't help but smile. "So," he said finally, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "That thing we found, it's important, isn't it?" She tilted her head, her glowing eyes meeting his. Slowly, she nodded, then reached into the satchel. With careful precision, she pulled out the crystal and placed it on the table between them. Its light illuminated the room, casting intricate patterns on the walls. The man leaned closer, mesmerized by its beauty. The huntress extended a hand, palm up, and made a series of gestures that he was beginning to recognize as her form of communication. Though he couldn't understand the specifics, the intent was clear. The crystal was not just important, it was vital. It held knowledge, power, or perhaps both. He frowned, trying to piece together the fragments of meaning. "Is it dangerous?" Her response was nuanced. She tilted her hand, palm down, and then gestured in a way that seemed to suggest duality, something that could be either a threat or a gift, depending on how it was used. The man nodded slowly, the weight of her answer settling over him. As the fire crackled, the huntress took the sphere from his mantle and held it out to him. He hesitated, then took it in his hands. The liquid metal shifted and flowed, forming shapes that mirrored his thoughts. A wolf howled. A star burned bright in the void. Then, unexpectedly, the sphere formed the outline of the obelisk they had visited, and the crystalline artifact appeared at its center. He glanced at her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "You're showing me how it all connects." She nodded, her expression one of quiet approval. She pointed to the crystal, then to the sphere, and finally to the man himself. He understood. He was now a part of this connection, this larger purpose that spanned worlds. The weight of it all made him lean back in his chair, his mind racing. "Why me?" he asked aloud, though he wasn't expecting an answer. To his surprise, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his heart. Her touch was warm, steady, and for a moment, he felt a flood of emotions that weren't entirely his own. Determination, trust, gratitude. She removed her hand and gestured toward him again, her meaning clear, because he had proven himself, his strength, his kindness, his willingness to help. The man swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know what you're asking me to do," he admitted, "but if you need my help, you've got it." Her expression softened into something that resembled a smile. She rose from her chair, taking the crystal and the sphere with her. She moved to the mantel, placing the crystal alongside the other artifacts. Then she turned back to him and gestured toward the door. "You want to show me something else?" he asked. She nodded, pulling her cloak around her shoulders. The man grabbed his coat and followed her outside. The night was clear, the stars blazing in the sky like scattered diamonds. She led him to a clearing near the edge of the forest, where the ground was undisturbed and pristine. The huntress knelt, placing the sphere in the snow. She pressed her palm to its surface, and the liquid metal began to expand, spreading out into intricate patterns that glowed faintly. The man stepped back, watching in awe as the snow around the patterns melted, revealing strange symbols etched into the earth beneath. "What is this?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She gestured to the patterns, then to the sky. Her movements were deliberate, her intent clear. This was a map, a guide. It wasn't just for their world, it spanned the stars. The man's breath caught as he realized the enormity of what she was sharing with him. This wasn't just about the crystal or the obelisk. It was about something far greater, a connection that bridged worlds, a purpose that transcended boundaries. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the glow of the patterns casting soft light on their faces. The man felt a profound sense of wonder and humility, as if he had been given a glimpse of something far beyond himself. Finally, the huntress rose, her eyes meeting his. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and trust. Though no words were spoken, he understood. Their journey was just beginning, and he was no longer alone in it. As they walked back to the cabin under the vast expanse of stars, the man felt a quiet certainty growing within him. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers or discoveries, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, not just to his world but to something infinitely larger. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and discovery. The huntress was methodical, spending hours studying the crystalline artifact and the strange map she had revealed in the snow. The man assisted her as best he could, gathering supplies, clearing space in the cabin for her tools and artifacts, and learning to interpret her gestures and expressions with increasing accuracy. Each night, they returned to the clearing where the glowing map etched itself into the snow. The huntress would kneel, tracing its intricate patterns with her staff, and the man would watch in silent awe as the symbols shifted and evolved, as though responding to her will. Over time, he began to notice faint connections between the map and the artifacts on his mantle. The spiraled object, for example, seemed to resonate with a specific constellation depicted on the map, its hum growing louder whenever that section of the pattern brightened. One evening, as they stood in the clearing, the man finally voiced a question that had been pressing on his mind. "This map, it's leading somewhere, isn't it?" The huntress paused, her glowing eyes meeting his. She nodded, then pointed to a section of the map that pulsed more brightly than the rest. It was a symbol unlike any he had seen before, a series of interconnected circles surrounded by jagged lines. She gestured to herself, then to him, and then to the map. "You're saying we're meant to go there?" he asked, his voice laced with both excitement and trepidation. She nodded again, her expression calm but resolute. She pointed to the stars above, then back to the map, as if emphasizing the journey's cosmic scale. The man exhaled slowly, trying to process the enormity of what she was asking. "I've never left this mountain, let alone this planet," he said with a nervous laugh. "You really think I can do this?" The huntress stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was steady, her gaze unwavering. She pointed to the artifacts on his mantle and then to his chest, her meaning unmistakable. He had already proven himself. The journey ahead was daunting, but she believed in him. The next morning, the man awoke to find the huntress already outside, her staff glowing faintly as she examined the edge of the forest. The crystalline artifact sat on the table, its light casting shifting patterns on the walls. He stared at it for a moment, then shook himself into motion, gathering his gear and stepping out into the crisp mountain air. The Huntress greeted him with a nod, gesturing for him to follow. They spent the day scouting the terrain around the cabin, marking paths and identifying landmarks. Though the man wasn't entirely sure why she insisted on this, wasn't their destination on the map? He trusted her judgment. She moved with purpose, her every action deliberate, and he felt a growing confidence in her leadership. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The man prepared a simple meal of stew and bread, which they ate in companionable silence. Afterward, the Huntress retrieved the crystalline artifact and placed it on the floor between them. She gestured for him to sit, then began to manipulate the sphere, her movements precise and fluid. As he watched, the sphere projected a three-dimensional image into the air, a stunning display of light and color that filled the cabin. The image depicted a massive, ancient structure, its design eerily similar to the obelisk they had visited. Around it, the land was barren and alien, the sky a swirl of violent storms. The man's breath caught. "That's where we're going, isn't it?" The Huntress nodded, her expression grave. She pointed to the swirling storms in the image, then to the crystalline artifact, and finally to the man. Her gestures conveyed urgency. The artifact was a key, and they were running out of time. The following days were consumed by preparation. The Huntress began assembling what appeared to be a transport device, using components from her satchel and the artifacts on the mantle. The man marveled at her ingenuity, though he understood little of the technology. She worked tirelessly, pausing only to rest briefly or consult the glowing map. As the machine took shape, the man found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since her arrival. The solitude he had once cherished now felt empty in comparison to the strange, exhilarating bond they shared. She had opened his world in ways he could never have imagined, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew he wouldn't trade it for anything. Finally, the day came when the Huntress declared the device complete. Or at least, that's what he assumed based on her satisfied expression. The machine was sleek and angular, its surface pulsing with a faint, rhythmic glow. The Huntress placed the crystalline artifact into a recessed compartment, and the entire device hummed to life, filling the cabin with a soft, otherworldly light. The man took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "So, this is it," he said, more to himself than to her. "We're really doing this." The Huntress stepped beside him, her gaze steady and reassuring. She extended a hand, inviting him to join her. He hesitated only for a moment before taking it, his fingers curling around hers. Together, they stepped into the light, their journey, and their bond, propelling them into the unknown.